his guilt or innocence. We'll look at that tomorrow night. Right now, we'll look at my man, Aaron Brown. We were together last night at NASDAQ.
Yeah.
We're back in New York together. I head back to California tonight. Aaron will carry on with 2 hours tonight. The suit said, Aaron, we love you. Go forever.
Well, they said most of that. Travel safely, Mr. King.
Thank you, Aaron.
We'll talk soon. It's nice to see you this week. Good evening again, everyone. Today is the day we all weigh in with our deep thoughts about why the election turned out the way it did. I have no deep thoughts, but I do have a couple of suspicions. The obvious ones, of course, 9/11 changed everything, and the president built a tremendous reservoir of goodwill for how he dealt with the attack. He seemed like a man's man, and people liked that. Obvious. Another suspicion. The decision by the Massachusetts Supreme Court legalizing gay marriage put a back burner issue front burner, and the president was able to capitalize on that, fold it into a broader theme about values. Which leads to number 3, my off-the-wall suspicion. One of the most important moments of the campaign had nothing to do with the campaign at all. It was the Super Bowl halftime show. Even without the Janet Jackson breast moment, it was a reminder to many how raunchy things had become in the country. That was the Super Bowl, not MTV, for goodness sakes. I suspect that a lot of people just knew the president was deeply offended by that, and that the senator and his party weren't nearly as grossed out. A difference in values. Fair? Of course not. Absolutely true? No way to know. As important as 9/11? Not nearly. But an odd little piece in the puzzle? Well, you can decide on that. The whip begins with things not in dispute. Our senior White House correspondent, John King, on the day after. John, the headline.
Aaron, unlike his father, this President Bush will get a second term, and he says he has not only a majority, but a mandate. Aaron.
John, thank you. On to Boston, the final day of the Kerry campaign. Candy Crowley wrapping that up. Candy, a headline tonight.
This was the day that John Kerry woke up and realized that he had a math problem. There was just no way he could make the numbers add up.
Candy, thank you. And finally, on the subject of numbers and surprises, Bill Schneider with us tonight. So, Bill, a quick headline from you.
Well, Aaron, we know how people voted on Election Day. I'll tell you how they voted on Election Night.
Bill, thank you. We'll get back to you and the rest shortly. Also coming up in the program tonight, Republicans break out the champagne and toast a new majority in Congress, a larger one at that. Also, the war in Iraq and the dangers it poses for the president's second term. And the election headlines, morning papers at the end of one of these hours, the second one, I think. All that and more in the next 2 hours. That's an enticement, we hope, not a threat. There's a lot to be said about what was decided last night, what voters want, what they fear, what's to be done at home, what's to be done abroad. What it says about who we are. That's the meat of the next 2 hours. We begin, however, by setting the table.
It is, in the end, a simple storyline. Broad reaches of the nation have embraced the president and his parties.
We will uphold our deepest values of family and faith. We'll help the emerging democracies of Iraq and Afghanistan.
The Republican red states overwhelm now the Democratic blue. Much of the Midwest, all of the midsection and the Deep South, the Southwest, most of the West, except for the coast.
Thanks to you, President George W. Bush won the greatest number of popular votes of any presidential candidate in history.
Not only did President Bush defeat Senator Kerry by nearly 4 million votes in the popular race, Republicans remained in firm control of the House and made impressive gains in the Senate. The count there now, 55 Republicans, 44 Democrats, 1 independent. Advantages that historically will be very difficult for Democrats to overcome anytime soon.
Senator Kerry didn't have that kind of connection with his base as the president did, and I thought that that was going to matter.
Even in states like Ohio, where job losses were high, exit polls showed voters believed the president would do a better job of fixing the economy than the man who campaigned so ardently to do just that. Ammunition for what is certain to be a long winter of discontent for the Democratic Party, firmly now out of power.
So the president and his party find themselves with very little standing in the way of some very ambitious plans. which oddly enough is no guarantee of success. Parties fall prey to infighting, events overtake plans sometimes, and presidents get things done with and without a mandate. As they say, your mileage may vary, but tonight clearly there is a tiger in the tank. Here's our senior White House correspondent, John King.
No recount and no doubt about the winner this time. A rowdy Republican celebration, but also an attempt to set a new tone for a second term.
So today I want to speak to every person who voted for my opponent. To make this nation stronger and better, I will need your support, and I will work to earn it.
But make no mistake, the victors seek bipartisanship, but on their terms, and believe a clear majority of the popular vote and bigger Republican margins in Congress give them the upper hand.
President Bush ran forthrightly on a clear agenda for this nation's future, and the nation responded by giving him a mandate.
Celebration on this day. Talk of cooperation will be tested early in the new term.
They'll be campaigning for the history books, for a legacy.
The Iraq War still divides the parties, as does a second-term agenda that includes tax simplification, healthcare changes Democrats say fall short, and revamping Social Security.
I see a great day coming for our country, and I am eager for the work ahead.
Senior Bush aides believe the first partisan dust-up could come within weeks. Chief Justice William Rehnquist has cancer, and the White House is quietly preparing to name a successor. And cabinet and staff turnover is in the works after a first term noteworthy for stability at the top.
There will be, in fact, wholesale changes in a second Bush administration.
Gone is the legitimacy debate of 2000, when Mr. Bush won the White House but lost the popular vote.
The voters turned out in record numbers and delivered an historic victory.
It was a dramatic turnaround. Early exit polls spooked the White House, and as Mr. Bush watched the votes come in, Ohio met expectations, a nail-biter, and the decisive state. Mr. Bush went to bed at 5 a.m., confident of re-election. This conversation 6 hours later sealed the victory and separated son from the father. Senator Kerry's call to concede guaranteed this President Bush a second term.
We had a really good phone call. He was very gracious.
Victory was vindication for top political advisor Karl Rove. Mr. Bush called him the architect, and the win silenced critics who suggested a Bush strategy so focused on winning support of religious conservatives would come up short. Instead, that strategy brought Mr. Bush a surge in rural and evangelical turnout, a record 59 million votes, the first majority for president since his father back in 1988. And, Aaron, even many Democrats tonight begrudgingly concede the right to claim for a second term a mandate.
Well, the truth be told, the president governed as if he had a mandate. Even when he hadn't won the majority of the electoral vote 4 years ago, we certainly allow him that now. There's so many things to ask. We could play who's on first or who's going to be. But there is, it seems, one overriding reality for the second term beyond the fact that he is a lame duck from the get-go, and that is there's not going to be a lot of money to work with. The deficit is historically high.
And that is going to force some tough compromises. He's going to ask Republicans less pork in the budget. He's going to try to reach out to Democrats, but he's going to try to shrink the budget in many of the departments the Democrats favor. And so this president has a very tough governing agenda now. They will celebrate today. They're already working on that budget, and it will be tough because many are skeptical. He can cut the deficit in half in 5 years. He must make a down payment in that first budget. The evangelical Christians, the social Christians supported him. The economics conservatives supported him too, but they are antsy about the deficit. They want to see action quickly.
John, thank you for your good work these weeks. It's been good to have you on the program so many nights. Thank you. John King at the White House. Democracies have rituals, some great, some small, some of them almost silly on the face of it, such as getting on the phone with the guy you spent the better part of 2 years campaigning against, sometimes bitterly so, and saying congratulations, the best man won. As John just reported, today Senator Kerry did just that, and by all accounts, he did it quite well. He spoke with the president, and the president spoke with him in the kind of gracious tones that would seem odd on the 2nd of November, but that are vital on the 3rd. And then Senator Kerry spoke with supporters in Boston. With that part of the story, CNN's Candy Crowley.
It only hurts when he breathes.
I'm sorry that we got here a little bit late and a little bit short.
2 years of late nights, early mornings, and long days. Seething heat, numbing cold, bad food, and sketchy hotels. Speeches, rallies, conventions, and debates. talking and listening, and then it got hard.
And I wish you know how much that I could have brought this race home for you.
He said all the right things in just the right way, that the votes were not there, that it was time to come together. More interesting was who he showed himself to be. Losing set something free in John Kerry, who reached out in a way seldom seen.
I wish that I could just wrap you up in my arms and embrace each and every one of you individually all across this nation. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.
24 hours ago, they were flying so high, certain that those giant crowds were an omen, that the long lines meant more hands punching the Democratic ticket, believing that the early exit polls would bring early victory. Democratic strategists say they did their job, but Republicans did it better. They will spend years thinking about what went wrong. Right now, they only feel.
I try to care about anybody I work for, but he's a friend.
John Kerry will return to the Senate. There are 4 years left in his term as the junior senator from Massachusetts. He's different, though. Like every presidential candidate, he set out to change the country, only to have the country change him.
I'll never forget the wonderful people who came to our rallies, who stood in our rope lines, who put their hopes in our hands, who invested in each and every one of us. I saw in them the truth that America is not only great, but it is good.
What's next for John Kerry? A staff aide says he's going to rest and regroup at a location TBD. Aaron?
Oh, there's, again, so many things to ask. If they could have one day back, does any one day come to mind, one moment come to mind they'd like back?
You know, certainly there's a lot of discussion going on, not from those closest to him, because that's all about feeling right now. But around him, when you talk to Democrats, they say, should he have spent that last week talking about the ammunition missing in Iraq? I think of all of the things, if you're just talking about one moment, I can tell you for sure that the one moment most Democrats hated was the windsurfing moment. That just really killed them. It showed up in a lot of the TV ads for the Republicans. They felt it said something that didn't describe John Kerry at all. But it's not so much moments as it is which direction the campaign went. Were they too hard on George Bush? Were they not hard enough? But you know, Aaron, as well as I do, the Democratic Party will spend the next 2 years trying to figure this out as they prepare for the next round, and they have to figure out which way they go here. And part of that process is figuring out what went wrong in this one.
Well, I would agree. Not that they want my advice or need it. I'd spend a little less time on what went wrong and a little more time on who you are, and that may get it done, or it may not. Candy, likewise, I think you broke your finger on this campaign, so you played on the injured reserve list. We appreciate your work. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. More now on what to make of who voted, how many, what they had to say when they voted, all of that exit poll stuff. We're here with Bill Schneider again tonight. It's been nice to have you here in New York with us, too. 4 years ago, we sat here for days and days and days amid a sense that half the country felt the election was being stolen, or maybe all the country felt it was being stolen. They just felt it was being stolen by different people. People look at the election last night as a fair deal.
Yeah, they do. In 2000, half the country said he won the election fair and square. The other half said he won on a technicality or he stole it. Well, this year, 3/4 of the country says, well, he won fair and square, and that includes both Republicans and Democrats. These were people we interviewed today, so it's a reaction not to the election itself, but to election night and what happened.
That graphic, I think, points to the difference between real people and the people who email me all day, by the way. On the question of how the president might be different 4 years from now, 4 years, or in this term, 4 years ago he campaigned as a uniter, not a divider. I think it's fair to say the country is still divided. People optimistic in that regard?
Yes, it is, to use a cliche, the triumph of hope over experience. They hope and they believe that this president will be a uniter, not a divider. But interestingly, Republicans say he'll be a uniter and Democrats say he'll be a divider. So they're divided over whether he'll be a uniter.
Well, or they may define uniter differently. Let me Let me ask you about just a couple of exit poll questions. People have been asking a lot about exit polls today, talking about did they, the anonymous they, the exit pollers, and to some extent we, miss the power of the values question through the campaign?
Yes, absolutely. We found that the values question was the #1 issue by a small margin to voters. It was a little bigger
to
than
voters generally, or to Bush voters?
No, voters generally. It was by a small margin. There were 4 big issues: values, terrorism, Iraq, economy. And values was slightly picked by the largest number of people.
And we're absolutely kind of winging it here, but if you broke that into a subset of Bush voters who considered values to be their primary issue, their issue of greatest concern, would it have been much higher than the, I think it's 22% who...
Yes, yes, it would have been. The people who said they voted on values voted 80% for George Bush.
How did we miss that? How did the pollsters miss that? How do we miss that?
That was the base campaign being run very quietly by Karl Rove out there in the country, and the Republicans. They were organizing a lot of religious conservatives, a lot of cultural conservatives. I like your comment about the Janet Jackson moment. That's the sort of thing that we missed because it probably had a lot of resonance, a moment of cultural coarseness to those voters that the media didn't really cover. But there is a subculture out there, and it's a pretty big subculture, which responds to those signals.
Just a final question on this. As someone who spends probably more time than actually you care to looking at polls and all of that, is there some sort of sea change going on that is going to make polling generally, exit polling, pre-polling, all this polling, less reliable than it has been?
Well, there could well be. The biggest danger is, of course, the increasing use of cell phones. So far, most Americans who have cell phones have home landlines.
Do you think people are as responsive to pollsters?
Oh, yeah, they are.
Okay.
I mean, there's one big problem, and that pollsters have to deal with. It makes polls more expensive, and that is when pollsters call people, they think they want to sell them something. So they don't want to talk. And the pollster has to go to some length to say, I'm not trying to sell you something.
I know, but everyone says when they're not trying to sell you something just before they try and sell you something.
Yeah, they are. But, you know, there's a dirty little secret about polling, which is most people enjoy expressing their opinions to a pollster because very few people ask them how they feel about Iraq and how they feel about the economy, and they're delighted that someone cares about their opinion.
Good to have you with us these last few days.
Pleasure.
Travel safely back home.
Thank you.
Head on Newsnight. Gays, God, and the Grand Old Party. Jeff Greenfield's analysis of the vote and moral values. We'll take a break first from New York. This is Newsnight.
Newsnight is brought to you by Pacific Life, offering insurance, annuities, and investments. Pacific Life, the power to help you succeed.
I have a writer on the staff who's always trying to work the phrase, nobody knows nothing, into a page on elections. He just did it again, and I let him. There is more, though, than idle eccentricity on his part. It reflects, we think, a keen eye for the difficulty of predicting which issues an election will turn on, even if it also speaks to a certain lack of imagination in the writing department. We're working on that. In the meantime, our senior analyst, Jeff Greenfield.
So, what was on the voters' minds Tuesday? Was it terrorism, the war in Iraq, the economy? No, if the exit polls are right, more than 1 in 5 voters said that moral values was the most important issue, and by an astonishing 80-18 margin, they voted for President Bush.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the President of the United States.
This may be the most important factor in the president's reelection, a long-term movement of voters from traditional policy voting, taxes, education, health care, foreign policy, to a less defined but powerful inclination to vote for candidates who share their fundamental views of right and wrong, vice and virtue. You can see this in a sharp division in recent years on so-called religiosity. Voters who went to church once a week or more voted 61-39 for the president. Those who never went voted even more strongly, 62-36, for Kerry. Those married with children, considered more likely to worry over the moral climate, went very big for Bush. The political consequences are also clear geographically. Small town and rural voters who once voted Democratic on economic grounds have migrated strongly to the GOP because of values. Missouri is a prime example. John Kerry won in St. Louis and nearby St. Louis County by margins big enough to have given a Democrat the state in past years, but this time a huge vote in rural areas pushed the state to Bush. Ohio saw a similar pattern. Kerry got the votes he wanted in Democratic strongholds, but an enormous turnout elsewhere delivered the state, and thus the White House, to Bush. The president's embrace of the values theme in the campaign was long planned and specific, to push the Democrats out of the mainstream by hitting the specific issues where most Americans were in agreement. Not the broad abortion issue, but a narrower target.
I signed the ban on partial birth abortion. It's a brutal practice.
Not an attack on gays, but a live and let live approach along with a specific stand on one big issue.
Marriage between a man and a woman is the ideal, and the job of the president is to drive policy toward the ideal.
Not so incidentally, gay marriage bans were on the ballot in 11 states, helping to draw out social conservatives. All passed. For years, Democrats have argued that values voters could be wooed back to the party with an economic message, health care, better schools, job security. But the evidence from campaigns seems to show that if voters don't see you sharing at least some of their attitudes on fundamental values, they will not even let you in the door to sell your economic wares. There's no bigger dilemma for the Democratic Party than this one. Jeff Greenfield, CNN, New York.
So it's an issue we're spending some time on tonight. We're joined by Mike Johans, the Republican governor of the state of Nebraska. He joins us tonight from Lincoln. And in Washington, Thomas Frank, who's the author of What's the Matter with Kansas, How Conservatives Won the Heart of America. We are most pleased to have you both. Governor, let me start with you. What is it that the Democrats don't get about what people sometimes call flyover country on these issues?
Well, there is a disconnect. There was that current that was running underneath, if you will, in terms of this election, and it was that values approach. And I heard it when I visited small towns and rural areas. They not only liked this president, President Bush, but they believed in his values. They talked about that. They talked about how much they loved his wife, Laura, and it was very powerful, and it kept coming up in conversations, and I think in some respects it was totally missed by the Democrat leadership.
I'm just curious if there's a difference here between likability, which the president certainly has, and these issues of values. Is it that they believe that John Kerry didn't have those values, or what values didn't he have that they wanted to see?
Well, in the past month, about every time you saw Kerry at a rally, he had a movie star with him, or a pop singer or a rock singer, and people enjoy movies and they enjoy the music, but they don't relate to that. I mean, that's Hollywood, and I just think that created even more of a divide, and this likability factor, I do think it fits in. I think one of the reasons they like the president, they like the First Lady, is they just felt a tremendous sharing of values, their family, faith, and the president talks about those things.
Thomas, is it a divide that the Democrats actually can close?
I think they can, but it's going to be tough. It's going to require a pretty dramatic shift of direction on the part of the Democrats, and by that I don't mean that they're going to have to, become Republicans on the culture war issues. I think you can beat the culture war issues without having to, to give in to them.
Actually, in playing back some of the things the governor just said, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but first of all, you got to like the guy. I mean, particularly for the president. And if you like him, you tend to place upon him values that you like.
Yeah, and in some ways, that's often what people mean by values is just that's that they like the guy, but they mean something else when they talk about the values issues. And this is important to understand, that this is part of a long a long series of culture war disputes going all the way back to the late 1960s, and there's a common thread to all of these, and that common thread is social class. Okay? These are class issues by proxy. This is a way for Republicans to talk to blue-collar voters, small farmers, people like that ordinarily, 50 years ago wouldn't have voted Republican in their, entire lives.
Governor, I think there is a theory out there, probably promoted by elitist Easterners, I'm not sure, that these social issues have somehow managed to convince working class people to, in fact, vote against their own interests.
I don't think so. In our communities, we have seen some of the good things that have occurred because of Bush's approach to agriculture, and we've seen commodity prices improve and those kinds of things. But I don't think so at all. In fact, I think the values is kind of the base starting point, and then people look at other issues critically. But I really do think that Bush just had more in common in terms of what he was talking about, in terms of his hopes and dreams, with the people of my state than Kerry ever did.
Is that message or messenger?
Well, both. He's a likable guy. I mean, you get around him and you can't help but like him. And on a personal level, it's just and he's the kind of guy you'd like to spend an afternoon watching a football game with and drinking a beer. He's just a great guy.
Stay away from the pretzels, though.
Yeah,
we'll give you the last. We'll give you the last word on this. Do you think this is now a permanent feature of American life? To me, this all began in around 1968 in the Bush-Houston Convention. The president's father, it was a huge issue, the cultural wars. Are we going to live with this for the rest of our lives, this divide?
I would offer this, Aaron. With the liberal elite, it's almost a boutique liberalism. It's every little cause comes along and they grab it. And people out here, they just don't relate to it. It's just the Democrats are just missing what people worry about here. They worry about raising their kids and faith and family and pocketbook issues. And I just think that was missed in this election by the Democrats.
Ms. Frank, last word. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. William Jennings Bryan was from Nebraska, and a greater fighter against imperialism there has never been from this country. Also, when you're talking about the Republicans doing good things for small farmers in Nebraska, 3 words for you: freedom to farm. Okay? Republicans pulled the rug out from under small farmers all across the Midwest, and they did it in the interests of their big corporate backers, as usual. 30 years of Republican rule in this country have given us more concentrated wealth, more unequal distribution of wealth than we've had in our entire lifetimes. That's not good for average Americans.
Gentlemen, someone has to have the last word. Now is just it. It's good to see you both. Thank you.
Good to see you.
We appreciate your time. Thank you. We'll broaden out the discussion on values and victory at the polls and where now the Democrats go and how the president might leave. We'll be joined by lots of folks, but we'll take a break first. This is Newsnight on CNN. The best thing about a 2-hour program is that it allows the sentences to run a bit longer, thoughts to be explained a little better, disagreements to get a fairer testing. So we offer up the next 2 segments with our next 3 guests. We're joined from Washington tonight by James Fallows, the Washington correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly, and Will Saladin, the political correspondent for Slate. And from Los Angeles tonight, the author and syndicated columnist and occasional troublemaker, Arianna Huffington. We're glad to have all of you. Arianna, we'll start with you. In a couple of sentences, keep this short so we'll build off of this, where did the Democrats go wrong?
They went wrong by making the central strategy of the campaign appealing to undecided voters. And as a result, they made this a campaign about competence. And to pick up on your earlier discussion about values, instead of this being about 2 alternative moral visions for the country, it became about Bush's incompetence versus Kerry's presumed competence, and they lost badly.
Will, what did the Democrats do wrong?
Well, I agree with Arianna about competence. That's not enough. The Democrats do need to learn to talk about values, and they need to do it simply. John Kerry's principal failing was that he said a bunch of things but never clarified an overarching principle. Everybody thought Bush was principled and Kerry wasn't.
Jim, where did the Democrats go wrong?
Operationally, there are a lot of little details you could look at, but I think they presented about the best a case they could on economic problems and on the management of the war in Iraq. So I think we've come to the long end of the trail that began with Richard Nixon in 1968 with the Silent American, of trying to figure out this same values connection to the middle of America that you've been discussing for the last while.
So just, all right, let's start building on this, Jim. Where do they go with this? They've been struggling with it for, for 30-some years now, trying to find the right message. And the truth is, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, Southerner, and Bill Clinton, Southerner, they haven't been able to close the deal.
Exactly. So they depended on these two flukes. I mean, Jimmy Carter, for whom I worked in that Victoria 76 campaign, his success was historically an accident on the back of Richard Nixon's Watergate problems, plus his own born-again status. Then you had the sort of freak of nature of the political talent of Bill Clinton, who was able to come out of Arkansas. And they can't manufacture either of those things. But I think that an answer we won't have tonight, even in 2 segments, but the party needs to look into its soul about is how they do solve this problem. I think that is another virtue of this election being as clear as it was. Nobody can say they stole this election. Nobody can say the Democrats didn't make their case about Iraq or tax cuts or anything else. So they realize there's something fundamental they need to begin addressing now.
You don't know how shocked I am to hear you say we can't solve all the world's problems in 2 segments, but I'll allow for that. Will, let me take gentle issue with something here. To me, it wasn't so much that they didn't present a simple, clear message. It's that the only message they really presented was vote against George Bush.
Yeah, but the problem is, if you had a simple definition of who you are and what you stand for as a party, you wouldn't have to just run.
Why are the Democrats so self-conscious then about who they are and what they stand for? Again, just an observation. The Democrats strike me as being far more self-conscious than self-confident.
Right. Well, because they have an identity crisis, because they haven't figured out how it all fits together. I think, I would take issue with one thing that Jim said. I'm not ready to concede that Bill Clinton was a freak of nature. I think that Bill Clinton, there's a reason why Southerners succeed in the Democratic Party. It's their religious traditions in the South. We've just seen in this campaign John Kerry, and before him in the primaries Howard Dean, 2 Democrats who came from the Northeast, very reticent Yankees, very uncomfortable talking about morals. There are a lot of issues Democrats can talk about in moral terms that they don't, because they come from a part of the country where religion is something you're supposed to keep to yourself.
Ariana, let me get you in this segment one more time before we take a break. You've been listening to all of this. What you said at the beginning was they went after the wrong people. They didn't energize their base. They went after people who they might not have, in the end, gotten anyway.
And that's related to what Will was saying about values. The Democrats need to redefine morality. They've allowed the Republicans to hijack it and reduce it to sexual morality. Morality is about much more than that, and values are about much more than that. The entire American history is really a journey towards a more fair and just society. That's about values. That's about corporations not defrauding the taxpayer through tax shelters overseas. And look what they did here. During the primary, John Kerry was really bold about that. He talked in a moral way about the Benedict Arnolds of corporate America. During the campaign, I talked to Roger Altman, who was an economic advisor, and he said to me, "Oh, Ariana, this was a very unfortunate phrase. We dropped it. We buried it." They literally took it from the website. That's how diffident they were. That's how spineless they were. And that's why everybody agrees here they lost this election. It was not stolen from them.
I need to take a break. We'll come back to all 3 of you and pick up on this. A break first. Around the World, this is Newsnight.
Newsnight with Aaron Brown is brought to you by Fellows, the world's toughest shredder, and by the Deepwater Explorers of Kerr-McGee. Explore more.
This year, nearly 10 million families could have their most valuable possessions stolen right from here. It's their own identity.
Bank statements, credit card and ATM receipts, pay stubs. In today's world, a little advice.
Shred anything you wouldn't want in the hands of a stranger. Hey, Tom.
Protect yourself at home with the shredder more businesses rely on for superior performance and durability. Fellows, the world's toughest shredders.
Imagine how much energy it takes to fuel an entire city of 1 million households, day and night, for 6 years. That's how much energy Kerr-McGee will recover from just one deep water field with just one production spar that produces offshore oil and gas where we couldn't before. Nobody delivers America's energy to Americans like the deep water explorers of Kerr-McGee.
Introducing Mercury Mariner. Save yourself the hassle. Get two.
If a lazy moment turns into the right moment, will you be ready? Get to know Cialis, the first tablet for erectile dysfunction that gives you up to 36 hours to choose the moment that's right for you and your partner. Cialis goes to work fast and can work for up to 36 hours. Cialis is not for everyone. If you take nitrates for chest pain or certain alpha blockers for prostate problems or high blood pressure, do not take Cialis. Such combinations could cause a sudden unsafe drop in blood pressure. Don't drink alcohol in excess with Cialis. The most common side effects were headache, upset stomach, delayed backache, or muscle ache. Erections lasting longer than 4 hours, though rare, require immediate medical help. Discuss your health status with your doctor to ensure Cialis is right for you and you are healthy enough for sexual activity. Ask your doctor if a free sample of prescription Cialis is right for you. 36-hour Cialis. When the moment is right, will you be ready?
CNN Sunday Night, a CNN investigation. Inside Saudi Arabia. Is it a breeding ground for terrorism? An all-new CNN presents Kingdom on the Brink. CNN Sunday Night, 8 Eastern.
Pick up where we left off before the break in Washington. Jim Fallows, Will Salatin, Los Angeles tonight, Ariana Huffington. Jim, just back to the Clinton thing for a second, and I guess as I remember that the first Clinton campaign, yes, he campaigned against George Bush the elder, but he talked about cops and he talked about working by the rules, people who worked by the rules and were still getting shafted, and how that had to be. Yeah, he was a once-in-a-generation, maybe once-in-a-lifetime politician, but he said something.
Sure, and so he was a rare political talent, I think we all agree. Part of what he said was extreme calculation that some people were cynical about, but he did show a package of approaches that could, in theory, be replicated to some degree. He was a governor. That's very, very, very important for showing you can actually do things. Also, it means you're likely to be located off the East Coast. He was a Southerner, so he was able to have that kind of kinship, at least, and use the language. He was a religious person, or at least, came across as a religious person. He could sound that way, and he'd done all sort of the hard things of running a state government, including sending people to death, including some controversial cases. So I think there are lessons from that for the Democrats.
Ariana, if you had to, looking at what happened last night, if you had to pick one or two people the Democrats should be growing right now to carry their message, whatever their message turns out to be after these next couple of years in the wilderness, who are those people?
Well, actually, the most important person that should be growing right now is Barack Obama, because Barack Obama can speak about values, can redefine morality, and can do it without falling into the trap of left-right. He presents it in terms of right-wrong, as he did during the Democratic Convention. And he does it in real moral language and with a fervor that is something that has been missing, that we really haven't had since Bobby Kennedy in 1968, when, as John Lewis said, that's when the soul went out of American politics. Remember, Bobby Kennedy spoke about values, and he appealed to red states and blue states, and he appealed to everyone. He galvanized people, and that's what was missing in this election.
We'll set Senator-elect Obama aside for a minute. Did what happened last night make it any more or less difficult, for that matter, for Hillary Clinton?
Well, you know, Hillary Clinton, everybody thought if Kerry lost, it would clear the field for her. And it certainly does that, with one exception. And the person standing in her way is John Edwards, if he chooses to run. Personally, I think that Edwards has much better appeal than Mrs. Clinton does to Middle America. And the exit polls from the primaries in this presidential campaign proved it. If you look at those exit polls, I mean, Edwards was the guy who talked about values, who applied it to economic issues, applied it to the estate tax, to the minimum wage. And you saw in the exit polls, he won significant percentages of independents and Republicans, of moderates and conservatives in those exit polls. If you're looking for somebody who can reach across and win some of those red states, I think he's the guy.
Jim, on days like this, we tend, I think, to some degree to exaggerate the plight of almost anything and anyone. Are things as bad for the Democrats as we've made it seem so far?
You're certainly right that things get exaggerated in the short run, but things are pretty bad for the Democrats. I think it's the first time since FDR that the president brought in more people with him when he was reelected. And again, the fact that George Bush had a net 4 million vote increase. He was, 500,000 behind Al Gore and 3.5 million ahead this time, after people had a full chance to absorb the budget deficits, the war in Iraq, the problems with Iraq intelligence, and that, I think, makes the Democrats say we have to consider something different. I would agree with Will that by the logic we've been saying for the last 2 long segments, John Edwards would be the kind of person well positioned if he could get some kind of administrative experience too.
He'll be an interesting person to watch. We ought probably not be talking about who's the first person to show up in Iowa and New Hampshire on the day after the election, but that's part of the American game, too. It's good to see you all. I now will consider the fact that I can't solve all the world's problems in 9 minutes, but I shall try again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Ahead on Newsnight, we'll slow things down to a freeze frame, as we do from time to time. Election Day 2004 in stills. We'll take a break first.
Your UBS financial advisor can work with nearly 66,000 people in 50 countries. He can work with all the resources of one of the world's largest wealth management firms. But to understand what you need, he will always work right next to you. Could this be the most powerful two-person financial firm in the world? You and us. UBS.
More Americans watch CNN than any other news channel. More Americans watch CNN. More Americans trust CNN.
Donka Nartana. Question. Why send a regular email when you can be like Ricky and send Comcast video mail?
Yeah, I needed to ask my parents for something, so I sent this. Relish, mayonnaise, old pickles. Send money. To your power's off? It's for effect.
Get video mail free with Comcast high-speed internet in a class by itself.
So, you have a sack of old coins. Are there any rare ones? Who can give you an honest appraisal? Professional appraiser and dealer of rare coins and currency for 30 years. The Coin Purse. Some people collect antiques. Some people collect junk. Some people collect a little piece of American history. Professional appraiser and dealer of rare coins and currency for 30 years. The Coin Purse.
Those of you who have experienced a meal at Jimmy Kelly's restaurant already know about the mouth-watering steaks and delicious corn cakes. You know about the incomparable service that has set the standard for Southern hospitality. It's the place to go. Come join us in our Victorian mansion, complete with cozy fireplaces, and treat yourself to the Jimmy Kelly's dining experience that 3 generations of Nashvillians have enjoyed since 1934. Jimmy Kelly's, Nashville's fine dining landmark.
What's up with the thing? Somebody left it on. It's been running all day. That's cool. Maybe we should do something. That's so not cool.
Don't just take a stand. Act. The most powerful way is to simply register and vote.
She helped
picked the jury deciding Scott Peterson's fate. Larry King, CNN Tomorrow.
There are by now precisely 847 ways of showing an election night unfold on television. This network used a Cinerama wall of numbers, and it was cool. Another network had dancing donkeys and elephants, and that was fun. But for all the gee whiz and whiz bang, sometimes the simpler the picture, the richer the story. So here are some of them, beginning with the candidates going to the polls.
It is such a wonderful feeling to vote. This election is in the hands of the people.
Like millions of Americans, I just cast my ballot. It's the great gift of our democracy.
We're in Canton, Ohio, where the folks have been voting for an hour and a half.
This was very busy earlier today. Election workers easily handled their early morning rush of voters.
Folks, how you feeling about it? Any concerns at all about what might happen in Florida this year?
No, I think it'll be fair.
We'll be able to start projecting some winners in states across the country.
I believe I will win. Thank you very much. I feel good about it. I'm glad to be able to watch the returns here with my family.
We are now projecting that Ohio is too close to call.
It's been a long night, but we've waited 4 years for this victory. We can wait one more night. President Bush has won the state of Ohio.
Earlier today, I spoke to President Bush and I offered him and Laura our congratulations on their victory.
America has spoken, and I'm humbled by the trust and the confidence of my fellow citizens.
Last night in Still ahead from us in the second hour, an update from near Fallujah, where any hope of an election seems far, far away. There's much more ahead in this 2-hour edition of Newsnight. Take a break first. Well, those screens tonight are not simply a reminder of what has happened in Iraq already. They're also a reminder of the challenges, and they are considerable, facing the president in his second term. Iraq was his war to start, and now it's his war to finish, and the former is always easier than the latter. Tonight, the death toll of American troops in Iraq stands at 1,124. The latest victim killed today in a roadside bombing in Baghdad. Today, as the outcome of the U.S. presidential election was still playing out, a memorial service underway in Iraq. Reporting tonight, CNN's Carl Penhall.
Remembering fallen comrades. A memorial service for 8 U.S. Marines killed in a suicide car bomb attack this past weekend.
A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace.
Hardened warriors paying tribute to dead buddies.
Never wanted to be here in the first place. But now he's in a better place. A place where there's no fear.
These Marines begin piecing together memories of the ones they've lost. Sergeant Kelly Courtney loved to write poems. Lance Corporal John Bird, a motorcycle fanatic. Lance Corporal Michael Scarborough dreamed of running a logging company. Lance Corporal Travis Fox, full of southern charm. Private First Class John Lukash took pride in his shooting ability. Private First Class Andy Riedel, a great Marine and a better man. Lance Corporal Jeremy Bowe, a devout Mormon, great machine gunner. Corporal Chris Lapka quit college to serve his country. The survivors of that Iraqi insurgent attack unafraid to show raw emotions.
It breaks my heart to lose one of my brothers. It happened so fast and it's very shocking. And I know you guys are going through the same pain.
The attack took place Saturday a few miles east of here. A Marine truck like this one had broken down and was being towed when a suicide bomber drove an SUV into the middle of the convoy. This Navy medic was blown out of the truck but survived with second-degree burns.
I looked back and the vehicle was on fire, and I saw some of my buddies still laying down on the vehicle.
Now, as these Marines wait for the order to storm the rebel stronghold of Fallujah, they're battling with sadness and rage.
He wants to burn Fallujah down for what those bastards did to him. And that's exactly what's going to happen.
Officers call on them to focus the anger. And as they pray for fallen friends, they have time to reflect too on their own mortality. I think the longer the war goes on, Aaron, the tendency for us as the media is to refer to the number of dead simply in numbers, but this memorial was certainly a somber reminder that the dead here have names, they have personalities, their wives, their mothers, their fathers also have names. It was a very somber reminder that the people that are dying here are very real people, not just numbers. Aaron?
Carl, thank you very much. That's why we show the screens every night. They are real people. We're joined now from Philadelphia by Trudy Rubin, the foreign affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and the author of Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration and Iraq. Here in New York, Ken Pollack, director of the Saban Center at the Brookings Institution, and his new book is called Persian Puzzle, a conflict between Iran and America, and we're always glad to have them both here. Ken, start with you. The president's victory give him more latitude in Iraq than he's had up to this point?
To a certain extent, absolutely.
Does latitude matter, by the way?
Yeah, I don't think that latitude is really the most important thing for the president. I think the answer there is how are things going to play out on the ground, in particular this military campaign which they've started. It's supposed to finish up over the next 2-3 months before the elections.
This is Fallujah.
Fallujah writ large, exactly.
Yeah.
Ramadi, a whole bunch of other places. They have got to make that country safer than it is if they're going to have any chance of pulling off these elections. And the elections have been key to their strategy for moving forward.
Trudy, before we broaden this out then in that regard, and you're reasonably critical of the president's handling of all of this, does a victory in Fallujah, Ramadi, and the rest, I mean, they clearly can win that battle. They can overpower the insurgents. The question is, do they create more problems in doing so?
I think that's the bottom line. There has to be a political strategy that goes with the military strategy. The administration failed over the past year and a half to woo away those Sunni tribal leaders who aren't really together with the insurgents. And unless they can convince those people that they've got a stake in the new Iraq, that they're not out of the game because they're Sunni, which was Saddam's support group, then the insurgents are just going to come back again somewhere else, and the Sunnis won't give them up.
How do you do that? I mean, is it you write them a check?
No, I think that the key is convincing them that there's a political role for them. One thing that Prime Minister Alawi was interested in doing was bringing back several divisions of the old Iraqi army. It was a Sunni institution. Now, he would have vetted out the bad guys with blood on their hands, but it seems the Pentagon wasn't interested in that idea. They want a new army from scratch. But one has to give these Sunni tribal leaders the idea that they've got a role in institutions, that they will get a percentage of the political power.
There's only so much political power to go around. I want to step back a little bit here. Stay in the region, though. Have the problems, Ken, in Iraq, and, you know, there's no point in sugarcoating this stuff. This post-war period has gone not well. Has it made it harder for the president to actually execute the Bush doctrine in other places if he were so inclined, like, let's say, Iran?
Absolutely. In fact, what you see today is a very different Iranian perception from what you saw a year ago. A year ago or so, the Iranians were quite concerned. They were afraid they were going to be next. Not so today.
Because?
Because the Iranians think that the U.S. is so badly bogged down in Iraq that there is no chance that the United States could use force against Iran. And they're not necessarily wrong.
Setting aside, Trudy, the question of whether using force in Iran would be a good idea or a truly horrible idea, and I suppose you could make both cases if you were so inclined, do the Iranians believe in your view, that someday, if not this day, if someday, they will in fact be attacked, and is that motivating them to find those nuclear weapons?
Well, I think that the question is whether the Bush administration really has given up the idea of regime change in Iran. You certainly hear a lot of talk about it from figures close to the administration, and even in the administration, the idea of the possibility of bombing Iraq's nuclear facilities if they do not stop their enrichment program, which the U.S. believes is headed towards producing a bomb. So I think the question is what's in the mind of the administration. Some figures inside of the administration think Iran is ripe for revolution, and if we gave it a push, the people would rise up. But you heard the same kind of things said about Iraq.
Last question, each of you, 10 seconds each. Do you think 4 years from now in the presidential campaign, Iraq will be a live issue? Ken?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Trudy, 4 years from now, do you think Iraq will be a live issue in the presidential campaign?
I think within 4 years, either we're going to stabilize it or we're going to have to get out.
Good to see you. Thank you both. Ken, nice to see you. Thank you. And on the program, how exit polling got the story wrong. Not as bad as you might think, but it didn't nail it either. How the media played it. We'll turn the lens on ourselves. The Brown Table joins us too. We'll finally find out what their predictions were the other night. Take a break first from New York. This is Newsnight. We are humbly reminded today of that first rule of computing: garbage in, garbage out. In a few words, that explains how the first wave of exit polls yesterday set the stage for some of the early reporting and a lot of the early reactions. In fact, we were warned that the sample was weighted more heavily female, for example, a sign of trouble. Mostly TV networks believed. Often the internet did not. Here's the media story from Howard Kurtz.
As word of the exit polls began spreading Tuesday across the nation's newsrooms and across such internet sites as The Drudge Report and Slate, the presidential race was, at least briefly, looking pretty good for John Kerry. And there were hints of that in the television coverage.
I think it's an uphill climb in Ohio. It hasn't been lost yet, but I think the Republicans have got to count on possibly losing Ohio.
What you have to say right now is that either the exit polls, by and large, are completely wrong, or George Bush loses.
But while no one made the kind of blunder we all remember from 2000...
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column.
The initial exit polls were, once again, off base, or at least far enough off base to convince many journalists that President Bush was in deep trouble. Could that have had an impact on people who were still considering whether to vote? It's hard to know for sure.
The problem is that the initial morning wave of exit polling was pretty raw stuff, not yet adjusted for the voting population or the flood of absentee ballots. And by the time the later waves were ready to be sent out, the system crashed for as much as an hour.
Meanwhile, as the actual votes came in and Bush began building a lead in Florida, the tone of the coverage shifted to reflect not exit poll projections, but real-world numbers.
One never wants to give up, but one has to be a realist, and tonight doesn't seem to be a very good night.
But the networks were cautious, remarkably cautious, considering how competitive the business is in making predictions.
The last thing we at CNN would ever want to do again is call a state for a presidential candidate and have to retract it later.
And with Ohio hanging in the balance, network anchors remain cautious until 12:41 Wednesday morning, when Fox News' Brit Hume projected Bush the winner in Ohio, bringing him just one measly electoral vote from victory. NBC followed suit at 1 a.m.
This race is all but over. President Bush is our projected winner in the state of Ohio.
But unlike 4 years ago, when everyone jumped on the Bush bandwagon within minutes, the other networks refused to be stampeded.
Yes, we're aware that in some other quarters, perhaps they have decided that they can project it as a winner, but we have to go by our own rules, our own traditions of being, we'd rather be last than to be wrong.
Brokaw says NBC decided not to call any more states to avoid anointing a president-elect. Despite the two network projections, nearly all newspapers went with carefully hedged headlines. Fortunately for the news business, John Kerry took everyone off the hook by conceding this morning. In the new media, zeitgeist, being second or third or fourth is not such a bad thing, at least compared to making an early call that turns out to be wrong. Howard Kurtz, CNN, Washington.
I was watching that thinking that may very well be. Last time may be the last time the big three anchors, Dan, Tom, and Peter, anchor an election night. Anyway, Roundtable is next. Collectively, they spent too many hours covering the campaign. They'll probably be glad when this one's over, too. Nina Easton, Terry Neal, and John Harwood. When last we talked, I said write down on a slip of paper who you think's going to win. John, you were kind enough to actually email me yours, so I know what you wrote, but I'm still going to make you say it on TV. John, who'd you pick?
I picked John Kerry. I believed all that stuff about incumbents being below 50% in their job approval ratings and in their pre-election surveys not being able to get there. And there were Republicans as well as Democrats telling me that their campaign experience suggested that. So I was right about one thing, though, Aaron. I told you we were going to have a result before I went to bed, and I haven't gone to bed yet, and we've got a result.
That's good. Yeah, you're batting 50%. That's very good. Nina, who'd you pick?
I picked Kerry, but look, last night's election was a clear victory for George Bush. 3 million plus popular vote. This is a vote that you have to go back to 1988 to get a majority that looks like what George Bush won last night.
Why did you pick Kerry then?
Well, I think at the time the undecideds looked like they were very much the type that would lean towards Kerry, more secular, more moderate. I expected that there was so much anger towards George Bush, but what I didn't see, and what I think a lot of us didn't recognize, was that there really is a conservative embrace of George Bush in this country, so that a lot of this when the Bush machine labeled John Kerry as a liberal, and I thought that was kind of outdated, that really wouldn't work, this sort of liberal Massachusetts label. In fact, that turned out to be catnip for the base, and that was a very strong motivator. And then a lot of the exit polls, we saw people saying that moral issues were what they were voting on. It wasn't just terrorism, and it wasn't just the economy, it was moral issues.
I'm going to come back to that. Let me get Terry's pick into this. I will tell you, I didn't bring my little slip of paper up, but after we talked, I wrote down George Bush, just so you know. Terry, who'd you pick?
Well, let me just set it up by saying I'm always really reluctant to talk about this because there are a lot of people who, when they hear journalists talk about predictions, often can't tell the difference between prediction and a desire, and this was really, came back to haunt me a little bit in 2000. I was covering the Bush campaign for the Post, and Alexander Pelosi, who made the documentary, came and put a camera in my face and said, "Who do you think is going to win?" And I said Bush, and it sort of got out there on the web.
Who'd you pick, Kerry?
Bush win. I picked Kerry. Okay. I picked Kerry. I thought, and for a lot of the same reasons that John did, but also because I felt that there was more intensity. Not that people don't like George W. Bush, but that hatred was more of a motivating factor than love, and I thought that combined with the fact that Bush was under 50% would push Kerry over. I thought it would be close, but I thought Kerry would win. All right, John, I want to go back to you. I want to throw a theory out and let you all weigh in if you think it has any validity at all. There was, to me, in this campaign, a kind of underlying feeling that because of 9/11, the people felt a certain loss of control over their own lives. Jobs are being outsourced. There's an economic loss of control, a security loss of control. The one thing they feel like they can control are the values that center them, which is why, in this theory, values rose so high.
I don't know, Aaron. I think that values crosstab on the exit polls really is a proxy for identity politics, and identity politics has been driving American voting choices for 40 years. I'm not sure it's much different this time.
Explain what you mean by identity politics.
Well, people tend to support people who they feel are like them, and so when you say values for a large chunk of people, especially conservative Christians, that means somebody like me. And that's why you see these, do you go to church services once a week or more? If you do, very lopsidedly on the Republican side. If you don't, lopsidedly on the Democratic side. I want to make one other point, though, about this value. Everyone's getting excited about values because that came out on the top of that issue ranking. We had a discussion about class around this brown table the other day. Don't forget the class dimension. If you look on these exit polls, if this election were conducted of people who made under $100,000, John Kerry would have won. George W. Bush racked up a big margin among people who made over $100,000. So don't forget the economic component of this, too. Tax cuts mattered for him, and the economic interests of people who have a lot of money, they associate those with the Republican Party, and that's an asset for them.
Nina, are you surprised, again, it's just my observation here, that Senator Kerry ran a very risk-averse campaign? Is that consistent with who he is? You literally wrote the book on him.
He is an extremely cautious man at the end of the day, and I think one of the issues I keep coming back to is his vote on Iraq. I mean, this was a vote that he took really very much in light of the election that he had to face. He was advised by the people around him that the way to run in a general election against a Republican candidate was to authorize authorize this resolution to go to war. In fact, it really ran counter to the John Kerry of many years, who typically opposed controversial military interventions. So I think he was cautious there. He was also actually cautious on his choice of John Edwards, which I don't think John Edwards, particularly at the end of the day, added much to the ticket. The other interesting thing, and I go back to this question of this: was there something wrong with the candidate or the candidacy? Could a liberal from Massachusetts really make a mark in a very conservative country? And would a Dick Gephardt, for example, have done better? Dick Gephardt was somebody who actually scared the Republicans early on, the prospect of a Dick Gephardt candidacy. Well, we look back and say, well, maybe that would have worked better. But, you know, it's interesting. I mean, this was a president who was roiled by a very unpopular and deadly war in Iraq, an economy with job losses at home. I mean, he was a vulnerable candidate. And the fact that John Kerry was not able to beat him, it really raises questions about either the candidate or the candidacy.
Or both. Thank you all for your work over the last month, and I'm sure we'll talk again. Thank you. Ahead on the program, we'll go to the bench, the Supreme Court, and look at how that is likely to change and what that might mean in the second Bush term. We break first. This is Newsnight. We return now to what next. One of the most far-reaching powers every president has is the power to appoint federal and Supreme Court justices. Since announcing he's being treated with thyroid cancer, Chief Justice U.S. Supreme Court William Rehnquist has not returned to the bench. It's all but certain the president will have an opportunity to appoint at least one, perhaps several justices in his second term. Perhaps before it begins, what's next is likely to be contentious.
We've seen it before. Clarence Thomas confronted by allegations of impropriety.
As far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks.
Attacks so harsh that borking became a verb in the political lexicon.
In Robert Bork's America, there is no room at the inn for blacks and no place in the Constitution for women. And in our America, there should be no seat on the Supreme Court for Robert Bork.
The troops are already preparing for the next Supreme Court nomination, and they don't agree on much, but they do agree on this. We are likely to see it all over again.
There will be a fight. You can almost count on it.
Of a firestorm of opposition, not just in the Senate, but in the country.
I am looking at a case decided by Judge Wilkinson, who's been listed on several of the media shortlists for the Supreme Court for President Bush.
As the Liberal Alliance for Justice lawyers are combing through the legal briefs and speeches, looking for signs that a nominee is too conservative, and not coincidentally gathering ammunition for a challenge in the Senate.
It's not borking, it's providing critical information to people about an individual who will be making decisions that affect their lives, not just for 4 years, but perhaps the next 40 years.
In the second Bush term, it's expected that at least one and possibly three new Supreme Court justices will be appointed.
There's likely to be more restriction on abortion, there's likely to be less affirmative action, there's likely to be more involvement with the government in religion.
But even with more Senate seats going to Republicans after the election, the Democrats will still have enough votes to block a candidate, to filibuster. They've done it before in the lower courts.
The sense was our side was getting its clock cleaned, and we need somebody who's kind of here as a constant force to monitor this and to rebut it. It's basically a truth squad.
Conservatives like Sean Rushton describe liberal activist groups as expert judge killers, and under former White House counsel Boyden Gray have organized to fight back.
So it's a political campaign just like any other political campaign, and it can get as nasty as any ordinary political campaign.
Important as it is, this is not just about who gets control of the U.S. Supreme Court. Senate Democrats complain that President Clinton's judicial candidates were unfairly blocked, and so have filibustered to stall some conservative nominees of President Bush. The president responded by appointing 2 controversial judges during congressional vacation, so-called recess appointments, the legality of which is being appealed to the Supreme Court.
Place to start a conversation with Robert George, columnist for the New York Post, and from Washington tonight, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, historian, journalist, Hayes Johnson. Nice to see you both.
Good to see you, Aaron.
Rather talking specifically about the court, let me start with you here, Mr. George. Do you expect Bush 2, term 2, to be as conservative, although I'm not sure you'd necessarily buy the first part of that it was conservative, as the first term?
I think it will. I would like it to be more traditionally conservative,
more fiscally conservative.
Fiscally conservative, indeed. He didn't veto anything on spending, for example, in the first term. And I'd like to think that because he has a little bit more latitude, he has a clear mandate now. He's got the popular vote. He's got more Republican senators, more in the House. He can actually govern as a fiscal conservative as well.
I want to come back to that. Haynes, do you think it is likely to be as conservative president as there was, or freed from the need to play to his base? He can take this where he wants to take it.
Well, every president in the second term has this dream of Mount Rushmore. They're going to be up there. They don't have to run again. It's wonderful. And they can do what they want, they think. But the trouble is it's very seductive because they don't have much time. And second terms can be very seductive and cruel to them because they can misread the country and they can push too hard. We saw an example today of one of the rare, really eloquent statements by both Bush and Kerry about going to the middle, helping each other, not polarizing the country. The country desperately wants that. We're coming off a very badly divided country. But it's going to be hard to continue that. It's going to be fascinating to see what Mr. Bush does with his opportunity. He does have an opportunity, but it also could be very tragically wrong if he goes too far. Well, one thing that he has that, say, neither Bill Clinton nor Ronald Reagan had in their second terms is he has both chambers of Congress.
He has a Congress to help him.
That's exactly right, and that's why I think he wants
to.
I think he wants to chart an ambitious agenda.
Well, here's the thing. The president, again, people can like his positions or not, is a guy of large goals, big ideas. He wants to change dramatically Social Security. He hadn't been very clear on how that's actually going to be paid for, but it's something he wants to do. He talked about tax reform, simplifying the tax code without really talking about what that meant. But these are big, grand ideas. Can you do big, grand ideas in a second term, which in some respects really only has 2 years before the campaign is on?
Well, that's a good question, and I think you can. And again, unlike his most recent predecessors, he's got a changed dynamic. He's got a clear political dynamic which he can take advantage of. And I'd like to think that the Democrats, I believe, are going to be a little bit warier of trying to block him procedurally because he now has a 3.5 million plus advantage in terms of popular votes to, in a sense, take to the people.
Haynes, just both as historian and journalist, are the Democrats likely to roll over for this guy or say, hey, we got 49% of the vote?
No, they're not going to at all, Aaron. In fact, nor should they. They ought to be very careful the way they handle it, obviously. But they have to sort of stand up for what they believe, if they know what they believe in. But they're not going to roll over. And the problem is there's very little time, realistically, for a president in a second term. He's there, and he's got only a few months to move really to the center or to try a few big ideas. And the clock is ticking. And this president, whether it was going to be Bush again or Kerry, I believe, and I thought for a year, was going to have a terribly difficult second term because of all the problems we've talked about. The war in Iraq is not going to go away. The clock is ticking on the deficit. We have problems here at home. We're badly divided. All the more reason to what Kerry and Bush said today, going to the center, trying to be remove the hatred in the country. That's going to be difficult.
Well, it's what we'll watch for a while, and we'll talk about coming up, I think, in the next few weeks. Good to see you both. Thanks for coming in. I know everyone's tired tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up on Newsday, candidates weren't the only things on the ballot, or the only ones on the ballot. There were lots of issues out there. We talked about gay marriage, marijuana in 3 states on the ballot, gambling in lots of places, winners and losers after the break. This evening on Lou Dobbs Tonight, Jeff Greenfield described the current House of Representatives as the most agenda-driven in recent memory. In January, it'll be all that and even more firmly in control of the Republicans. Same goes for the Senate, though parliamentary procedural limits the majority's power there somewhat. That said, the days of divided government now seem like ancient history. Reporting for us tonight, CNN's Ed Henry.
Senate Republicans broke out the champagne after a stunning sweep on election night. Republicans see it as a repudiation of Democratic efforts to block President Bush's agenda. Their biggest prize? Beating the Democratic leader, Tom Daschle.
The message to the Democrats is stop the obstruction, stop the pass interference, stop the delays, stop the filibustering, move forward, get through the elections, and act for the American people.
A much different scene in South Dakota.
My family have been at the base, and I have been at the base of Mount Rushmore as the sun rises. Those colors are warm and sweet and optimistic. Having seen sunsets and sunrises, I like sunrises better.
Majority Leader Bill Frist flew around the country to celebrate with his winning candidates. Republicans picked up 4 Senate seats. That gives Frist 55 seats, making it easier to push through the president's second-term agenda. More tax cuts, conservative judges, tort reform, and an energy bill.
Comprehensive energy policy. We lost it by 1 vote on the floor of the United States Senate at a time when the price of oil is $50 a barrel and gasoline is almost at record levels.
Democrats were stunned after also losing seats in the House and falling short in the presidential fight.
We have lost just about everything that we can lose.
They will now try to pick up the pieces, starting with a new leader to replace Daschle. That's likely to be Harry Reid of Nevada. Democratic strategists say the party needs to walk a fine line, agree with the president some, but fight back as well.
By working with the president, among other things, and when they can't work with the president, by standing up and expressing their disagreements with him clearly, forcefully, and with respect.
It looks like Senate Democrats, at least for now, are taking a more conciliatory approach to their relationship with President Bush. Harry Reid is known as somebody who works across the aisle with Republicans. Ed Henry, CNN, Capitol Hill.
As for now, that would be 24 hours after the election. The initiative process is either an example that our democracy works or that it doesn't. I've never been sure. In either case, there were a lot of initiatives and referenda last night, from gay marriage to the allocating of electoral votes to gambling to pot. A sample of how they played out now.
Supporters broke into victory cheers in Oregon as Measure 36 passed, a measure banning gay marriage. Opponents, on the other hand, wept and promised to fight on.
True love cannot be defeated.
Across the nation, 11 states had ballot measures banning marriage between people of the same sex, and every one of them passed, by a large margin. In 8 states, the ban extends to other forms of civil unions and partnership rights. Supporters said it was a vote for traditional values.
Most people didn't see this as a referendum on gay and lesbian issues. They saw this as an issue of marriage.
Christian activists told CNN that the state vote showed strong support for a national marriage amendment. Gay activists promised immediate legal challenges.
We believe very strongly that this amendment is unconstitutional.
Across the country, there were 163 ballot measures last night. Alaska and Oregon voted against loosening their marijuana laws. Montana voted for medical marijuana use. And Arizona passed a controversial amendment that will crack down on illegal immigrants. This one will end up in the courts. But it was California, the home of the voter initiative, that had the biggest night as Governor Schwarzenegger declared victory.
This is what I love about Election Day, because when the people flex their muscles, then the state gets much stronger.
The governor fended off initiatives that would have made all companies provide health insurance for their employees and ease California's tough three-strike sentencing guidelines. He also pushed through a massive 10-year, $3 billion research program into embryonic stem cells that could put the Golden State in the forefront of medical research. But it also put Governor Schwarzenegger at odds with President Bush and social conservatives who proved so influential in the fight against same-sex marriage.
Quick look at the initiatives from last night. Coming up on the program, there's the University of Miami in Ohio. Really, there is. And based on yesterday's vote, there's reason to believe Ohio learned a lot from Miami 4 years ago. That story and more. This is Newsnight. Turns out Ohio was more of a hiccup than a roadblock last night. Pundits predicted the Buckeye State would be the battleground, much like Florida was in 2000 over contested ballots. They were right, and they were wrong. It was a battleground, all right, but not for polling monitors and disputed votes. It was a battleground for the faithful. They came out in droves because they believe in a higher power, believe in President Bush. Now it's safe to say they are a force, a considerable force to be reckoned with. Here's CNN's Dan Lothian.
The headlines in Ohio screamed cliffhanger.
We turned out not only young voters, but
Protesters screamed for every vote to be counted. But in suburban Columbus, where manicured lawns were decorated with Bush-Cheney signs, loud amens from the evangelical faithful, like Lynn Ransbottom.
I think he has a deep commitment.
Her vote tied to her strong belief in values.
I think that that can be the basis of more good things happening in the future.
In the mother of all battleground states, where a near-record turnout stretched voting into the wee hours, a surprising and convincing showing by the Republican Party base. Christians who proudly wear their faith on bumper stickers next to W signs. This car belongs to Bonnie and Lester Pfeiffer, who say even with the war and worries about the economy, President Bush was the only choice because of what he believes.
We appreciated his viewpoint on the stem cell issue.
He conducted his campaign with grace and honesty. I like him.
Accepting the Holy Bible. The evangelical community in this state is strong and, unlike 2000, more energized, in part, say some voters, because of the anti-gay marriage initiative which passed.
Bush was so adamantly against that stuff.
The family is basic to our country and its welfare. And so goes the family, so goes the nation.
In exit polling, 23% of Ohio voters surveyed said moral values was the most important issue. And of those people, 85% voted for Bush. But how did faith take a leap over the most pressing issue in the state? Job losses. More than 200,000, mostly in the manufacturing sector, gone since President Bush took office.
We tend to associate rational voting with pocketbook voting. But rational voting can be a function of whatever is the most salient set of preferences you have.
But driving her vintage VW, Gina Giannetti, who is proud of her faith, isn't convinced. She voted not with her heart, but with her pocketbook.
Senior citizens, they need help with the medicine, with the hospitalization. They don't have enough help at all.
But evangelicals in this state say this election was a wake-up call.
The heart and soul of America is much more biblically centered and God-centered than many people want to think. And this election brought them out by the thousands.
We're thankful. We're thankful for what has taken place.
They believe their prayers were answered. Dan Lothian, CNN, Columbus.
Well, if Ohio was the new Florida last night, the red state with the blue collar that provided the cliffhanger and ultimately decided the race, where does that leave the old Florida, which is Florida? In spite of all the speculation and worry about what might happen in Florida this time around, history did not repeat itself. Here's Susan Candiotti.
Run and vote. Every vote counts.
Turnout, turnout, turnout.
Go, go, go!
This year, nearly 2 million more Floridians went to the polls than in 2000. President Bush besting Senator Kerry by about 5 percentage points. Forget a mere 537 votes.
Hurry, go! You got to be in line. If you're in line at 7, you get to vote.
Strong Bush support came from those who credit his faith-based values and anti-abortion stand, say exit polls.
Never been more proud of my president. Somebody will stand up and confess that he loves God and pray, and I'm proud of him.
Regular churchgoers also came out for Bush in big numbers, up nearly 70% over 2000.
A lot of people relate to Bush because Bush is openly religious.
The Latino vote, about 52 to 44%, helped push Bush over the top, as predicted, especially along the I-4 corridor across Central Florida.
Family values, hard work, the American dream. And that's where the Hispanic community is, and that's where we offered them.
In Osceola County, where Al Gore won 4 years ago, Bush won easily here. A third of the voters were Hispanic, and Bush won a majority among them.
But it'll be somewhere 50s, in the upper 50s.
CNN exit polls show the war on terror was overwhelmingly the key issue for Bush Florida backers. The war in Iraq, only 25%. The president's brother sees it this way.
I think there's a belief in our state that it was inappropriate to change leaders during a time of crisis, a time of war. And the president clearly, I think, explained to the voters of this state that we are at war. Senator Kerry couldn't quite get there.
This Kerry supporter, who flew all the way from Alaska to volunteer in Florida, is circumspect.
There's one consolation that I wasn't sitting home and doing nothing. At least I gave it my all.
Governor Jeb Bush admits his brother faces a divided nation. As he put it, the president will have to reach out and soothe the wounds, adding, "I know he will do it." Susan Candiotti, CNN, Orlando, Florida.
Still ahead, an update on the non-election news of the day. News now. Quick look now at some of the other stories made news around the world today. Ahmed Karzai, officially Afghanistan's first freely elected president. Karzai was named interim leader after U.S. forces defeated the Taliban. The election held last month. Karzai getting over 50% of the vote. That's how it works in an election. In Paris, there are conflicting reports about just how sick Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat is. An Israeli newspaper claiming Arafat's health is seriously deteriorated. Sources close to the Palestinian leader deny that report, but acknowledge he continues to undergo treatment. In Iraq, another video of Margaret Hassan has been released, though it is said to be too graphic to air. The insurgents holding her, threatening to turn her over to a group that has beheaded several other hostages already. Ms. Hassan heads up CARE in Iraq, or did. Redwood City, California, after months of testimony, hundreds of witnesses, and countless cable TV programs, the jury finally has the Scott Peterson case. They began deliberating today. And as for the election, here's a look back at some of today's defining moments. Not only did President Bush win the electoral vote, he also won the popular vote by more than 3 million. Mr. Bush got almost 59 million votes across the country, 51%. Senator John Kerry, 55,300,000, 48% of the vote. Ralph Nader, 1% of the vote, and probably planning his next campaign. When Senator Kerry offered his concession speech in Boston this afternoon, he said he'd called the president and congratulated him. He also said it was time for Americans to come together after a long and bitter campaign.
I did my best to express my vision and my hopes for America. We worked hard and we fought hard, and I wish that things had turned out a little differently. But in an American election, there are no losers, because whether or not our candidates are successful, the next morning we all wake up as Americans.
John Kerry in Boston today. During his victory speech in Washington, the president also talked about bringing the country together, sort of thing you say on a day like this. He thanked the record number of voters who helped turn out the vote that put him back in the White House.
I want to thank the thousands of our supporters across our country. I want to thank you for your hugs on the rope lines. I want to thank you for your prayers on the rope lines. I want to thank you for your kind words on the rope lines. I want to thank you for everything you did to make the calls and to put up the signs, to talk to your neighbors, and to get out the vote.
The day in morning papers after the break. Okay, time check morning papers from around the country and around the world. The headline is the same, and the story's the same. The headline isn't the same, otherwise this would be a completely dumb segment to do, wouldn't it? I think it would. International Herald Tribune, published by the New York Times in Paris. Bush wins second term by a solid margin. Battle ends quietly as Kerry concedes. A couple of other things. I like this, just an analysis piece. Kerry failed to connect on the economy. I wonder if there's more to that. It just seemed to me that Senator campaigned hard, but he failed to connect on a lot of things, and that's an interesting problem for the Democrats. If I'm right, I may not be. Washington Times, 4 more years, proud Bush declares mandate. Keep that headline in mind, okay? Proud Bush declares mandate. And they also put on the front page, producing a Hollywood flop, A-list support for Kerry failed. The very Washington Times sort of story. On the front page, George Soros, Springsteen, Michael Moore, Eminem, you got it. The Cincinnati Enquirer. Bush prevails. Ohio finally pushes him over the top. So they got themselves a hometown story, and they play it that way. Philadelphia Inquirer. America has spoken. In victory, Bush speaks of new chance to reach out to divided nation. Okay, now, down, remember, talked about mandate. Go down the corner here. Caution, Specter says president has no mandate. That would be Republican Senator Arlen Specter. Do you think he's getting a call from anybody today saying, don't be saying that no mandate thing? Miami Herald, President Bush. Pretty simple, straightforward headline. GOP wins firm control of national agenda. It does have that. A pledge to reach out in the next term. They always say that. I don't know if they ever do it. But there you go. Boston Herald, Senator's hometown paper, though it rarely has anything nice to say about Senator Kerry. Dems in disarray. Seemed like a good reason to put Hillary Clinton on the front page, too. Look to Hill as savior. I'm not sure what this story's about. This one, town snubs hero's widow. Well, that's why, the front page in a tabloid doesn't always help you much. The Oregonian out in Portland, Oregon. Bush calls for unity. President reaches out for those who voted for Kerry. Voters again prove Oregon is in neither party's pocket. That is the truth. It's a very independent state. The Rocky Mountain News. I love this picture. It's just a great, I don't know who shot this. It's a wonderful picture of the president, though, isn't it? America has spoken. The Rocky Mountain News in Denver, Colorado. State went for the president. The Detroit News, it's right in front of me. I don't know why I paused there. Bush vows to unify divided country is their headline. Moral issues pay off for Bush. The president was able to draw voters who trust him. Well, it seems like the sort of thing you have to do to get somebody to vote for you. 15 seconds. Where's my Sun Times? Here it is. We'll end it with the Sun Times. They lead, of course, with the president down here. Cops blackmail targeted TV anchor. So I was talking to Bill O'Reilly. I said they got to stop suing us, whatever it is. Weather tomorrow in Chicago. Ain't no sunshine. We'll wrap it up in a moment. Okay, that's it for tonight. 2 hours seems like plenty, doesn't it? We'll go back to an hour tomorrow. I promise. Good to have you with us. So until tomorrow, 10 o'clock Eastern Time, good night for all of us.